I think the expression, our speaker needs no introduction, is never more redundant than in this case. Willie Dalrymple, you all know, is the most read British historian of his generation, and importantly for this evening, the author of the most important Raj quartet since Paul Scott. But although I think his more recent and perhaps better known writing has focused on history, let us not also forget that Willie stands in that proud tradition of British travel writing. And speaking for myself, I think that two of his travel books actually are among the finest things he's done. I think that his outrageously youthful essay in Xanadu, and then the more recent, perhaps slightly more mature reflections on contemporary life in India, 9 Lives, stand out as great writing on modern South Asia. But we're going to be historians this evening, and we're going to talk about Tipu Sultan. A disclaimer to begin with, because obviously Tipu Sultan, there are many different ways in which one could approach this topic, and you'll see from the images around you that this exhibition, and indeed our discussion, is really going to focus on British perceptions of Tipu at the time. So when I embarked on putting this exhibition together, I said to my colleagues, this is not an attempt, as it were, to present a balanced, proportionate view of Tipu Sultan. It's an attempt to present a distinctly unbalanced, biased one from 200 years ago. I think that those in India today who excoriate Tipu, and there are some, the interesting reflection perhaps for them is how close their arguments align with those of the British 200 years ago, and how closely they depend upon colonial source material to advance their view. And that's perhaps something we will explore. But essentially what we're here to discuss is how did the British perceive Tipu Sultan? And that's also rather, as it were, an excuse for the fact that you're confronted this evening with two Britons. It's two Englishmen telling an Indian audience about one of your great national heroes as we see it, and in fact, the only perhaps point of contention which came out of the last great exhibition on Tipu Sultan was how much the relative claims could be made for the Scots as against the Englishmen.
It's all Scots.
So again, we're entirely balanced in this respect. You have a Scotsman and you have an Englishman. William. Let's start because obviously the pictures will come to the pictures. The pictures really depend upon an existing narrative. They're tapping into something that the audience for these pictures already knew. So we need to start with talking about what was that thing that we thought that the British knew about Tipu at the end of the 18th century. But let's just start with a slightly wider canvas. And let me ask you, what sort of a state was Mysore under Hyder Ali and then in early years of his son? I mean, you, William, you've worked on a lot of Indian states of this period. Most obviously, the Mughal Empire on Hyderabad during this very period. So what kind of a state, against that geopolitical background, do you think Mysore was?
So first of all, weirdly enough, although Giles and I have known each other for 30, coming on for 40 years, this is the first time we've actually been on a stage together, very bizarrely. And I was just thinking, as Giles was showing me around, that my very first visit, aged 20-something, to Mehranga was clutching Giles's recently published PhD on Rajput palaces and trying to understand the incredibly complicated and brilliantly worked out sequence of building that you had established. And apparently you just told me...
I got it all wrong. I worked it out right 20 years later. Yeah.
Also, though, thank you to DAG, who have been very, very generous in a variety of ways to me over the years, most particularly when, just before the COVID epidemic, I put on a show in the Wallace Collection with Xavier Bray on Indian painting for the British. We didn't use the phrase company school painting, though inevitably almost always we ended up in conversation talking about company school painting. But it was the idea, it was the Indian masterworks produced for British painting. And it was an incredibly ambitious show involving huge numbers of loans from America and which would have left, I think, the Wallace collection permanently in debt to its bankers, but for a very generous sponsorship from DAG, which was a life-changing thing for the show. And so I'm very, very grateful to all of you, and very pleased to be here today talking in your spectacular new premises. I should also say that not only as a Scot do I have an axe to grind here, I have an entire family history linked with Tipu. And opening the wonderful catalogue to mug up for this talk on the plane, in the inside flap, I turned the page, and there, sitting here, which is a map of Srirangapatnam, it says down there, Major Dalrymple's position. Which I had never seen before and saw for the first time in the case over there 5 minutes ago. And this is the story of an extraordinary link, because the East India Company, among the many other things that it did, completely changed the history of particularly lowland Scotland. And in the 18th century, lowland Scotland moved very quickly from being one of the poorest places on the globe to one of the richer places on the globe, thanks to looting this country. And one of the reasons that the Scots bothered attaching themselves to the English was because the English had an empire and the Scots had failed to get one. And there'd been a variety of catastrophic attempts at sort of setting up a colony in Columbia and other places. And the lowland Scottish gentry, who then controlled Scotland at the beginning of the 18th century, joined England in order that they might get their hands pragmatically on all the wealth that they imagined would come. And to be honest, it worked. And Scotland, even more than England per capita, benefited from the looting of this country. Also trade, of course, also in a variety of ways, but also it widened the horizons. And of the people involved in the scenes surrounding you here, a disproportionate number were Scots, which is why the Scottish National Gallery had a big show 15 years ago, curated by Anne Buddle, which was the last big Tipu show before Giles put this wonderful show together. And in the middle of this was two neighbours from lowland Scotland, Bairds, who were a very middle to low-ranking squire family with a small Scottish, damp, boggy Scottish estate. And their next-door neighbours, the Dalrymples. And James Dalrymple, whose Major Dalrymple position is in this map, came out as a young ADC, aide-de-camp to Sir David Baird, was captured, was defeated, very nearly killed, both badly wounded at the Battle of Pollilore, when Tipu and Hyder Ali together made mincemeat for the very first time of a company army. There'd been one major defeat of a small detachment from Bombay that went up the Ghats and was defeated by the Marathas. And it was relatively small in numbers. The next year, Tipu wiped out an entire army. Not only that, but associated with this defeat was the man who had just defeated not just the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam, but Mir Qasim and Shuja-ud-Dawla, this three-army mega force that decided to try and take on the company and expel it once and for all in 1765 at the Battle of Buxar. The man who won that victory, Sir Hector Munro, was the man who was defeated effectively, or whose wings of his armies failed to meet up at the Battle of Pollilore, which is the moment that Tipu enters the wider British consciousness. And the fact that he had not just defeated this army, but had wiped out an army, and more importantly, captured the officers, who then spent 3 humiliating years in Srirangapatnam being made to dance at his dinners, convert to Islam, do menial tasks, and all the kind of things that captives, you can make captives do. Tipu did this then. And this is the point that legends start to spread in Britain, that there is this new kid on the block who, for the first time after many defeats, culminating in Plassey and Buxar, now suddenly the Indians are giving it back. And it's no longer certain that a company army with modern weaponry can defeat Indian armies effortlessly. And all those figures, like in Plassey, where there's tiny numbers of company troops defeating vast Mughal cavalry armies, that period's over, because now these guys are around and it's all completely different. And so while in this country, people are brought up on stories of the Rani of Jhansi and Shivaji, particularly in this city, and all the other freedom fighters who defied the British at different points, the one who made the most impression in Britain was Tipu Sultan, which is what this is all about. So Giles asked the question, what kind of state was Mysore? So the background, the wider background, is that you have an incredibly successful centralized state operating under the Mughals for, 1560 to 1730. So for that period, you have the richest, most productive empire, along with probably the Ottomans operating at the same time in Istanbul, is in this country. It's a centralized state. It has very high rates of taxation on the peasantry. It's not a particularly nice place to be a peasant of any religion. But it builds spectacular monuments and it trades magnificently. And under Mughal rule, you get this figure, which is quoted quite a lot these days, of India is approaching around between, depending on which of Madison's figures you use, between 25 and 40% of world GDP, while England is only, again, huge discussion, but between 3 and 7% of world GDP. So this centralized, rich empire with particularly strong industries of textiles, but also spices and other things going on, takes over for this period. And then after Nadir Shah comes to Delhi, runs off with the entire treasury, as well as the Peacock Throne and the Koh-i-Noor and everything else, the whole thing shatters. And it's like, imagine you go to the top of the Taj, you go to the top window on the top of the tower here, and you throw a mirror at the window. And it falls down and it smashes on the ground. That's what happens to India at this period, because all the money which has been spent by the Mughals to make an army of 1 million men, with a centralized administration running with paid civil servants and taxation and nawabs and governors, and this whole structure disappears overnight. And suddenly it's a free-for-all. All the Rajput states that Giles studied in his PhD start building these incredible, well, they've already been building nice things, but they build even more, accelerate, because they're not sending the taxes to Delhi or Agra. They're building their own things. And all those wonderful things suddenly pop up in Udaipur, Hyderabad, Mysore, these successor states all over appear. And because they can just keep their local taxes, because they're not paying tax to anyone, you suddenly find all over the country this spectacular efflorescence of architecture. And among the many Mughal successor states which appear across the landscape, you have a completely new one, effectively, founded by Hyder Ali, who there's no real strong evidence for who he is. Some people say he's Punjabi, some people say he's from Karnataka, but he's a mercenary. He's one of the first Indians who gets how to do the new form of warfare. In the 7-year war, not 7-year war, in the War of the Austrian Succession, and around that time, a new form of warfare develops in Europe, involving infantry armies, not cavalry armies, involving muskets, not swords, and involving new developments in ballistics, mobile horse artillery. And it's not rocket science. Anyone can do this. You can train people up quite quickly to learn this stuff. And even the technology of the muskets and the cannon are not particularly difficult. And the English train up Highlanders to do it very quickly. But when this form of warfare is brought in 1740 into India, it has a devastating effect. And between the first time it's used by the French against the Nawab of Carnatic's army on the outside of Madras in 1740, through to Polilu in 1780, there's 40 years when European armies of very small European armies can massacre and win over large, substantial, old-fashioned Indian armies. And what Hyder does is he just watches what the French particularly are doing, but also the British. And he may or may not be formally attached to the French, but he certainly has French allies. And he learns this new form of warfare. And Paul-Éloi is the moment that for the first time, not only does he use European tactics and European weapons against Europeans, he also improves on it by having a cavalry wing. So as well as the squares of infantry and the horse artillery, he has an incredible cavalry wing. And he defeats the company. But as well, it's a big administrative success. Out of nowhere, he and his son Tipu begin building state trading companies. They see that the British East India Company, the English East India Company, has a trading fleet and factories. So they decide to go and have a trading arm in Oman, Aden. Where is it? They have state monopolies and various things, including silk, which is introduced at this time into Karnataka, and for the first time Tipu establishes it, and it's still a big deal, obviously, all around Mysore. And there's a whole load of different armies, a whole load of different industries. And British and other travelers at the time note how this is a prosperous state, like a garden, says one traveler. Other people comment various times how incredibly rich the crops are. And it's a model state. But it has no effective legitimacy in the sense that it's just a mercenary has created this. They use the cover of the old Wadya Rajas who are kept in by the end, the young is kept in what one British observer says is like a garden shed before he's put back on the throne by Wellesley afterwards. But they basically absorb and take in the old Wadya state and create something new, as everyone is doing. So these different Rajputs are all fighting with each other. The Marathas are erupting, whole new Maratha states are popping up in Nagpur, in Gwalior, in all these different spots across India. And among the many new states that appears at this time, this is not only one of the most successful economically, but by far as the British are concerned, the most successful militarily.
Okay, so let's focus on the military technology, because you've in answer to my question, you've located Mysore in this kind of Mughal afterglow. And as you rightly say, is that as the Mughal central power declines, you have the regional powers arising, and with it also whole new forms of urbanism, which of course is what excites me about them. So in Murshidabad, in Lucknow, you mentioned also, yes, Jaipur, Hyderabad. But the British don't have a relationship with any of those.
A lot of the stuff that tourists, sitting outside having a quick swim before this tour, looking at all the tourists, they will be going next to us. And a lot of the stuff that any tourist sees on a basic Golden Triangle trip around India is built at this time.
In the early 18th century. But so the British at this point have absolutely no connect with Jaipur at all. That comes much later. With all of the other places you've mentioned, there's always a negotiation. I mean, it ends ultimately with subjugation, Murshidabad, and then not until the middle of the 19th century. With Hyderabad, it's an ongoing kind of... But somehow they get locked into this existential tussle with Mysore, where it's got to be one or the other that's destroyed. They can't coexist. They learn to coexist. The British learn to coexist with everybody else, even in South India, Tanjore, Hyderabad, Coorg, but not with Mysore. So we need, as it were, at some point to sketch the chronology, because you've mentioned Paul-Éloi. There are, of course, 4 Mysore wars. Unless you've read either the catalogue or the Anarchy recently, you may not have them clearly in your mind. So we better just sketch them for you, I think.
But I can't do the dates. Can you do the dates?
Well, yeah. So the first one is Hyder. That's 1767 to the end of that decade, 67 to 70. Then the second is 1780 to 84. You don't hear too much about those in the British sources because they went really badly for the British. Essentially, in the First War, the British are trying to take on Hyder, and he outmaneuvers them. He shows his greatest strength, and he surrounds Madras. And they think, okay, can we just go back to where we were before, please? So you have a kind of status quo ante restored, with an exchange of prisoners, an exchange of taken force, and so on. So that it ends in a and it's supposed to end in a mutually supportive treaty where they agree to support each other against other enemies. And the British immediately renege on that agreement when the Marathas invade Mysore. And so that's what drives Hyder Ali into the arms of the French. He knows that the French are the Brits' greatest enemy in South India, so it's a case of enemy's enemy becoming the friend. But also the French supply the military technology, which is...
And slightly better military technology by this stage than the British.
In both terms, both of fortification and in terms of firepower. And those two things go together. It matters what you're firing and where you're firing it from. You know, the French are essentially a step ahead of the British. And the whole idea of a fort changes in the 18th century from, you know, the medieval thing that's surrounded by a defensive wall. A fort becomes a platform from which you fire a gun, and it's the gun that's
one of the great sort of lost opportunities of literature is that the guy who designs this new form of fortification, is that Montabert, is he called? He writes a book called The Fortification Perpendiculaire. And his great pupil, person who studied this, is Laclos, who wrote the Liaison Dangereuse, Dangerous Liaisons. Any of you remember Glenn Close and Uma Thurman and all that stuff? And Laclos is about to come out to India and become governor of Pondicherry. And he's arrested at the harbour, but for which we might have one of the great sexy Indo-French novels. And we'd have Uma Thurman and Aishwarya Rai together or whatever. But anyway, so the French have got much fancier scientific ideas.
So that's part, I think, of what
Srirangapatnam is the...
They rebuild Srirangapatnam, essentially, as a modern. So the Second War, the culmination, Willie's referred a couple of times to Pollilur. So this is a maneuver where the British forces are trying to unite together into a single large army to confront him, and Hyder Ali and Tipu manage to keep them apart and surround.
It's a good story, actually, because what happened is that you have Hector Munro, who's the Scotsman who's won Buxar. Plassey is a more famous victory, but Buxar's actually the one that puts the British in charge of the whole of North India. And this guy, who is presumably the great general, is sitting in Kanchipuram, and he's waiting for troops because Tipu has declared war and surprised them all. And this small Scottish force is trying to march down from Machilipatnam or somewhere. They've landed a little bit north of Madras. But it's the monsoon, and they make the crucial mistake of camping one particular night on the edge of a river. And they don't cross it. They camp on the northern bank. And that night, the heavens open in a monsoony Indian way, and it rains, and it rains, and it rains, and it rains. And 2 days later, they can't cross the river. And all this time, Tipu and Hyder are coming very fast over from Mysore. And this small Scottish force, newly arrived in kilts, including Baird and Dalrymple, but also a lot of Scots Highlanders who were redeeming themselves, having fought on the Jacobite side with Bonnie Prince Charlie, and were trying to get back into the good books of the British government. These Highlanders arrive, they're disembarked, they travel for 3 days, and then they get stuck because of the rising water. And this is the moment that Tipu does this maneuver, and he cuts them off. And Hector Munro and his troops are inside the very well-fortified walls of Kanchipuram. And Tipu manages to, he's helped by the fact that they can't cross. But when they finally do cross 3 days later, it's too late. And Tipu has got spies in their army, I think he pays the guides to mislead them, and they don't make it to Kanchipuram, and they get stuck just within sight, 15, 20 miles away. They can see the highest Gopuram of Kanchipuram across the rice fields, but they can't reach it. And they try and they make a second mistake. They they have the option of marching all night, but for whatever reason, they decide to have 3 or 4 hours rest. And they set off at dawn, and by the time they come down the hill, still 15 miles from joining up with the other force, Tipu's there. And they fight this, Tipu and his cavalry fight this amazing artillery barrage. And then it kind of stops, and there's this beating of drums and noises of music. And the British think that Hector Munro is coming to rescue them. And it's not Hector Munro, it's Hyder Ali. And Hyder Ali comes, and they're completely surrounded, and it's a total wipeout. Bloodshed, cracking bones, cavalry, horses screaming. I mean, it's got a complete mess. And then they start cutting off heads, and they start presenting heads to Hyder Ali. And they only keep a few officers alive, including my forebear and Sir David Baird.
For which we're enormously grateful.
for money, for ransom.
So you will not be surprised to learn that there is no British representation of the Battle of Polylore. The only known image, there's a little map in the next room.
I had no idea
by an officer called Innes, who essentially does it as a diagram. Don't do this again. But there is a painting of the Battle of Polylore painted for Hyder Ali. It's a mural on the side of his palace in the Darya Daulat Bagh in Srirangapatna. It's about 100 feet long. And so obviously we couldn't have it in the exhibition because it's in Srirangapatna, it's a mural. I would have loved to have dragged the whole thing here because it's nice, as it were, to make the balance, as it were, to put
I have to ask us, did you bid for the copy?
We took an interest in the copy. There is a mid-19th century paper copy of it, which is not about a third of the size. It's still an enormous thing, and Willie wrote the catalogue entry when it was sold again recently in Sotheby's. So that's the counterpart to the original of this. We'll come to the Robert Carr Porter, which is a depiction of the 1799 siege, which the Brits won. The Polylore mural is the counterpart. So obviously we couldn't have it in the exhibition. We have got it in the book, as it were, to make that juxtaposition.
It's a fabulous thing.
It's an amazing painting. So that, I think, we're up to number 2. But obviously that's a turning point for perceptions of Hyder Ali and Tipu in the British imagination because he seemed to be a very serious threat. He's won a war. Bailey and Baird, the leading generals who are in charge of the surrounded force, are both taken prisoner. Bailey dies in prison 4 years later.
There's a little memorial to him in Srirangapatna.
Baird is, in fact, released in 1784 as a result of further negotiations, and indeed lives to lead the siege, ironically. What comes out of that are, again, there's a whole chapter on this in our book, the so-called prison narratives, the stories written by British officers and men who were captured at Polylore and who were incarcerated. Those who survived then made their fortune writing memoirs of about how badly treated they were and how they were tortured and so on. This becomes a whole subgenre of British memoirs.
And a big variety of different sorts. I mean, there's some which are kind of rip-roaring horror stories. There's some quite thoughtful ones, like the Lindsay narrative.
Indeed,
and it's the ultimate colonial nightmare because not only are these guys humiliated and made to wear dresses and made to dance and do something, but some of them choose to convert to Islam. And then some of them who are released then find that they're so used to eating with their hands that they can't use knives and forks again and this sort of stuff. It's the colonizer gets colonized, and this is something new. This hasn't happened before.
So let's just very rapidly complete the chronology so you've got it in your head so you can understand how we get to this. So number 3 is 1790 to 92. So it's a decade after Polylore. And you've got a new Governor General, Lord Cornwallis. And Cornwallis is a military man.
Cornwallis, incidentally, is the guy, any of you seen The Patriot, the terrible Mel Gibson film of the Civil War? Cornwallis is the guy who loses to Washington at the Battle of Yorktown. And he, having extricated himself from Yorktown, he's then appointed by the East India Company. This private concern buys this failed politician and sends him off to India. And he's desperate to redeem his military reputation.
Precisely because he's been singed at Yorktown by the Americans and by the French. He finds himself in South India and he's up against the French again, and he thinks he's going to have a nice little war. And actually, it doesn't go too badly for him.
And he's saved by the Marathas. This is the bit you don't hear about in the current narratives.
He succeeds in capturing Bangalore in 91. He has the first go at Srirangapatna immediately, but is repulsed partly by the monsoon.
And as they're retreating, they see these what they call scouts, these cavalry scouts on the top of the mountains, and they think that they're surrounded. And it's the Marathas. And the Marathas rescue them because, again, this is one of the bits that, history is complicated. And, it isn't black and white, these things. Tipu never makes a treaty, it never makes an alliance with the British, but the Marathas do. And Tipu at one point writes to the Nizam of Hyderabad, and Hyderabad has just made an alliance with the British. And Tipu writes this letter, which survives, saying, "Are you crazy? Do you not know the way of the British? Wherever they fix their talons, they never let go again." And Hyderabad ignores that, and actually does very well out of it. Hyderabad's one of the few winners in this story. It ends the largest, richest princely state right up until 1948.
So having been rescued in his first attempt, Cornwallis immediately comes back and he has another siege of Srirangapatna, and he doesn't capture it, but he is able to make Tipu surrender. And so he imposes on him a very, very unequal alliance where he has to give up half his territory, he has to pay 3 crores in compensation, and crucially also he surrenders 2 sons as hostages. And that's, as it were, that's the first thing that begins to enter the iconography of British art. This idea that
appalling pictures.
Yeah, but the story is told in the British accounts as a sort of great act of benevolence. If you heard this today, if you heard that Putin demanded the surrender of Zelensky's children, you'd think, I don't think you'd look on that as a kindly act. But that is precisely how it's portrayed, as this sort of great act of paternal care. He gives them pocket watches. So the boys are eventually released. I mean, they're not killed.
Not before they've been made to attend a 5-hour service of Judas Maccabeus in Madras. They have to listen
which was no doubt very good for their education. However, so that's the end of that episode. And then it's curious that there's a truce then. But why? It's because the next Governor General, who is John Shaw, follows instructions from London, which is don't make war. I mean, Cornwallis got away with it because it takes months for news to get backwards and forwards to London. And so he's a free agent.
Important point. It's one of the big things, it's one of the big continuities in the history of the company, in that if you're the East India Company, you actually want to trade. There's a lot of money to be made here. Fantastic textiles. You can sell them to the French. You can make huge amounts of money. But if you are a soldier in the 18th century in India, you don't make money from your salary. Where you really become rich is when you're part of a successful war, and then you get to loot, and you get to take home goodies, tiger finials, nice bits of throne, and so on, and stuff them in Philip of Powys Castle, or wherever it is. And so you have 2 divergent interests. It actually suits the company not to conquer and have endless wars. And you find these endless letters coming out from these businessmen in London saying, just have a peaceful trade. And then you have all these soldiers whose entire life depends on winning a war and conquering somewhere.
And from what you said of Mysore earlier, it would have made much more sense to trade with Tipu. Because here you've got, he's a brilliant administrator. He's introducing new industries like sericulture. His agriculture is well organized. As you say, it's a garden. Everyone describes it, even Cornwallis described it as a garden. Why would you want to make war in a garden? For just the reason you suggested. So John Shaw keeps things quiet. He releases the boys. And then later, at the end of that decade, you get Richard Wellesley sent out as Governor General. And he's another belligerent one. He's not himself a soldier. His younger brother is, and actually is going to emerge as Britain's greatest soldier ever.
The Duke of Wellington.
He's Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, the man who defeated Napoleon. But this is a long time before that. I mean, this is.
And Richard Wellesley is this extraordinary character, fascinating character. He's brilliant, far brighter than Arthur. He is a peacock. He loves to sort of sit in the limelight. He's showy. But he also has a very complicated relationship with the French. He's got a French courtesan wife who, against all the morals of the time, he marries. And publicly shows. But then she doesn't come out to India, and he comes alone. And he is sent by Dundas to remove the French from India. That's his job, because Napoleon this is now, the Battle of the Nile is about to happen. There's all this, Britain is at war with France. And Wellesley what's interesting is that there's been a change in the East India Company. The East India Company, which starts off as a libertarian free market thing, running its own thing for profit, went bust, rather like the subprime collapse. And 50% has been bought by the government. And since 1780, it's now a public-private partnership. And initially, the government slightly knows it doesn't know much about India and is happy to let East India Company men like Hastings govern on behalf of the government. So it's more or less business as normal. But Wellesley, for the first time, is sent out specifically by Dundas to use the East India Company armies for the sake of the nation. And so you get a kind of state cuckoo in a private nest. And the company, which really would have done much better to carry on trading with Tipu, is put onto war footing by Wellesley, who quadruples or quintuples the company debt. And on top of all the wars, which is where he also wants to live grandly, so he decides to commission a copy of Kedleston to live in, the largest country house in Derbyshire, which he just builds, and then he builds a 20-mile avenue to Barrackpore to connect it. He has these kind of although he's actually from a fairly modest, although we now think of the Duke of Wellington as this very grand figure, they're actually fairly modest Anglo-Irish family with ideas way above their station.
Well, he's a member of the peerage.
Yeah.
I mean, he's at this stage he's known as
Irish.
He's Lord Mornington. Actually,
the Irish peerage, which is a huge issue for him.
Yeah.
He hasn't yet got a British peerage.
But I mentioned that because, of course, the other change that's happened is a change in the French. They've had a revolution, as you say. We're into the Napoleonic era by the time of the siege. But the crucial thing is France has had a revolution. They've cut heads off aristocrats. That looks odd. I mean, it doesn't sit well if you're Lord Mornington. And so the fear that Tipu is not just in alliance with the French for the purposes of military technology, but there are suggestions that he's in alliance with them ideologically. And I think Tipu is really playing along with it. I mean,
Tipu sends ambassadors. Which get to France. They get to the Napoleonic France.
Yeah.
And then, to everyone's horror, when Wellesley's just begun this whole process, so his first thing is to get rid of the French troops in Hyderabad. There's a guy called Jacquemart who runs a French troop, and he sends. This is my White Mogul's book. This guy called Kirkpatrick goes to Hyderabad, and his job is to get rid of Jacquemart and the French, and that happens. And the next thing is to get rid of Tipu and Lally and the French who are at Tipu. Tipu, who is this sort of autocrat, sort of has this weird Republican club in Srirangapatnam, where he's known as Citizen Tipu. And they have all these sort of bizarre Republican rituals.
And there's secret communication with the governor of Mauritius, something the papers are discovered, which suggests that he's going to incite a kind of French-style revolution.
But then it actually becomes a reality, because Napoleon manages to dodge the British fleet, lands in Egypt, and writes letters to Tipu. And Tipu writes letters to him. And they're going to go from Egypt down the Red Sea and turn up in Bombay. And this is going to become a reality. So what had seemed like an outlandish and unlikely alliance, suddenly they capture letters. And Napoleon's on his way. He's got to Alexandria. And actually, it never quite all happens, because having dodged Admiral Nelson then comes across the French fleet in Aboukir Bay and sinks it. So Napoleon has to think twice before carrying on. So the French never actually join up with Tipu and throw the British out of India. But again, this is something that in 1799 looks very realistic possibility.
And hence the decision that Srirangapatna has to be taken. And so the force is sent by Wellesley under Baird and Lord Harris. And it's a fairly...
a large Hyderabad contingent.
Yeah, it's a very efficient operation. And they breach the wall and then they storm the fort. And
Tipu goes down fighting.
Tipu goes down fighting. So, let's talk a bit about then some of the images, the paintings of this, because, okay, so we got newspapers, for example. It takes months for the news to get there, to get to Britain. But almost as soon as it does, indeed, as soon as it does, there are artists who begin to cash in on this. They know that here is a subject that's caught the popular imagination. The newspapers are bringing information about it to London. Can we not bring an image to sort of make it real? And some of the prominent artists who do this, they're young artists who are trying to establish their names. They're looking for a way, a new niche. History painting is a respected, reputable genre of painting, but it hitherto mostly focused on subjects from ancient history. If you wanted to be a history painter, you chose pictures out of classical antiquity, out of
too brute,
exactly sort of thing. The Trojan War. But the idea that you could apply this approach to living history, to recent events, has just about taken root. And a number of artists think, well, we're going to do this for the Fourth Mysore War.
Benjamin West.
This is Henry Singleton. So this is the painting that, as it were, sparked off the shooting match for us, for DAG, because this is a painting that painted by young Henry Singleton, showing, it's called The Last Effort and Fall of Tipu Sultan. It shows Tipu going down under an onslaught of redcoats. And this was painted and exhibited in the Royal Academy in 1800, immediately after.
And what is Singleton using as his models for this?
Well, that's the crucial point you anticipate, because of course Singleton never went to India, and indeed the three major artists who are in this room: Henry Singleton, Robert Carr Porter, and Mather Brown. Mather Brown did this work and that one in the corner of the women. This is another Singleton, as is the one over there. Those three artists who were the most successful in representing events from the Fourth Mysore War never went to India. The complete ignorance of India was no impediment to depicting these scenes. So they're relying on the first-hand accounts written by...
across the empire, isn't it? I mean, what's the wonderful picture of Quebec and the death of Wolfe?
That's Benjamin West, who never went to Canada.
Quebec.
Yeah.
And then he paints the gifting of the Duani with Clive taking this piece of paper.
So there are artists who are here, and we'll get to them, but they're not the action painters. The action painters are never went there. So they're relying on narratives written by soldiers and officers who were involved in this, particularly somebody like Major Dirham, who wrote his account on the boat on the way home, as it were, published it immediately on arrival, so that you've got a literary source to use. But when you come to this, the crucial bit of this, I think, is that it's not just that Singleton wasn't there and that he's relying on written sources. It's that when you read those written sources, you realize that nobody on the British side saw the moment when Tipu fell. It's not that he's painting somebody else's description of this event. Nobody saw it. And what the narratives tell us is that they take the fort and
they go looking for it.
And they go looking for him. The night begins to fall because they start only at 1 o'clock. It's not a dawn raid. They start at 1 o'clock because Baird thinks the Indians are going to be sleeping, having a siesta after lunch, kind of thing. That's the best.
Baird, remember, has been in the prison here for 3 years, so he thinks he knows the.
He thinks he knows the terrain.
What's going on?
Yeah. So they start at 1 o'clock, And they're mopping up by about
They have a
5,
dram
6.
and a biscuit before they go in.
But then think, what about the Sultan? Where is he? And he ought to be surrendering. Should we go to the palace and find him? And it's at that point some servant of his says, "No, I saw my master fall," and he escorts Baird to the body.
With a lamp.
And again, so some of the pictures, they're not in there in the next room, show that moment, again, very kind of dramatized, the finding of the body.
And in the accounts, there are these descriptions, because they've heard he's somewhere there, but the bodies are piled high. And they have to spend an hour moving corpses in the dark.
So he's buried under 30 other bodies. So the likelihood is that he was killed by a distant shot, not by a close encounter.
There is one description of the close encounter, and there's one eyewitness from the Mysore side that says that he was wounded, and his aide de camp or whatever says, "You better go back and get that seen to. Go back to the palace because he's got a wound." And he says, "I would rather die," and he charges into the port, the Sally port, and then apparently one British soldier tries. He's wounded a second time, and the guy tries to reach for his jewels, and he then tries to hit him, and he's struck twice by. So there is quite a detailed description, whether it's authentic or not, of his death.
So let's take that particular description and see how that plays out, because what you see in this picture, when we were setting up the exhibition, when I first started looking at this, I assume that what's going on here is that this character here is the unseen hand, is, as it were, thrusting a dagger into the side of poor old Tipu, whose turban is already off. He's already in a state of humiliation because he's lost his turban. His supporters are fierce but cowering. And there's plenty of backup. You see, there's another Brit here, presumably with bayonet fixed, by the way he's holding it, and this guy who's directing the musket fire of the other two.
I've got the description somewhere if you'd like it.
But the question of the jewels is troubling because the hand is unseen. And if you think that what's going on here is that Singleton has read the account that Will is about to read, then what's going on here is not the bold assassin, as it were, the valiant warrior, but a thief. And so a celebratory painting that is meant as a sort of a celebration of British arms, of British victory, is actually rather ambiguous as an image, which is what I think makes it a great painting. It's kind of tripping you up in what's going on here. It's
I can't find it. No, it's
well, but nevertheless, he's paraphrased it. That's what it is. Yeah. The idea is that the person, the Brit who was involved in his final death, was trying to steal his cummerbund.
That's right.
That's the idea. And so the unseen hand could indeed be reaching for the cummerbund, the jeweled cummerbund. Yeah. So then, because obviously so many of the paintings are meant to be celebratory. They're celebrating the success of British arms and so on. This central painting becomes a little more complex. Let me tell you about this one. So this is a print. Obviously, the other crucial thing to say is that, so all of these artists I've mentioned, they produce these paintings almost immediately, they display them publicly, but they want a much wider circulation. And so they have their works engraved so that they can be disseminated, and also they can make more money out of it. And indeed, most of these pictures, they exist in multiple versions, and in foreign languages as well. I mean, Henry Singleton, there are versions where the title is in French. Interesting, that's what he thought would be the next best audience after the British. Not in Canada, for example, but in French. And there are German editions as well.
I've got the detail here.
Okay.
When he'd heard the news that the assault had finally been launched, Tipu left his lunch place at the palace and rode straight to the breach, accompanied by the bodyguard of his elite Lion of God battalion. By the time he arrived, the company troops were already within the walls. There was nothing for him to do but climb on the battlements and fight for his life. Outnumbered, bravely taking on the overwhelming incoming rush of company sepoys, he quickly received 2 bayonet wounds and a glancing musket shot in his left shoulder. His attendants called on him to surrender, but he replied, "Are you mad? Be silent." Here, between the water gate and the inner ramparts of the fort, Tipu stood to make what even his most hostile British opponents acknowledged was his gallant last stand. A party of redcoats had forced their way between the gates, and one grenadier, seeing the gold buckle sparkling on the waist of the wounded man, tried to grab at it and received a last fatal sword slash from the Sultan in return.
Oh.
Seconds later, one of his companions shot Tipu at point-blank range through the temple. After 4 wars against the company over a period of 32 years, the Tiger of Mysore finally fell, sword in hand, among the heaps of dead and dying men. Within a few hours, the city was in company hands. That evening after sunset, Baird was taken to Tipu's body by one of his courtiers, Raja Khan. The scene was altogether shocking, wrote an eyewitness. The number of bodies was so great and the place so dark that it was impossible to distinguish one person from another. They had to roll the bodies off the pile, one at a time, checking the face by the flickering light of a lamp. Eventually, Baird found Tipu. As chance would have it, his body was only 300 yards from the gate of the prison where Baird had spent his captivity. The Sultan's body lay at the bottom of a heap of dead and wounded, stripped of his jewels. Tipu's eyes were open, and the body was so warm that for a few moments in the lamplight, Baird wondered whether the Sultan was still alive, but feeling his pulse, declared him dead. His countenance was in no way distorted, but he had an expression of stern composure, wrote Baird. His dress consisted of jackets of fine white linen, remembered another eyewitness. Below, he wore drawers of flowered silk, with a crimson cloth of silk and cotton around his waist. A handsome pouch with a red and green silk belt hung over his shoulder. His head was uncovered, his turban being lost in the confusion of the fall. He had an amulet on his arm, but no ornament whatsoever. The corpse was placed in a palanquin and taken to the palace. There, its identity was confirmed by Tipu's captured family.
So you were reading for yourself, but who was the source for the description of the encounter?
One of the attendant.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that suggests then a rather different moment after this, if the thief is indeed killed.
He's lost his turban there. Maybe it was known already. Yeah.
So do have a look. We're going to wrap up shortly and invite questions. But the picture of Baird discovering the body is on the other side of this wall, or a print of it. The original painting is in the National Gallery of Scotland. And there's an interesting story behind that painting as well, because it's painted much later than any of the others. And there's a particular reason why it's later. Immediately after the siege, Baird, of course, has to go off back to Madras to give his report to the Governor General, to Richard Wellesley, who immediately appoints his younger brother, Arthur Wellesley, as commandant of Srirangapatna. Arthur has been there as a very junior officer, and he's not involved in the crucial bits of the siege. He's kind of involved in the kind of follow-up. He is put in charge of this division of the spoils, actually.
And he stops the looting.
He stops the looting. But it's essentially a minor role. But what happens in the following decades, of course, is young Arthur Wellesley becomes the Duke of Wellington and the conqueror of Napoleon, the most famous British military hero of all time. And so 19th century views and understandings, as it were, retrospectively tend to give him the credit for Srirangapatna.
And you often see, even in biographies of Wellington, Elizabeth Longford, for example, credits him with leading the attack, which is completely erroneous.
So this distinctly cheesed off David Baird's widow. Baird dies, of course, and she thinks, well, everyone now thinks it was Wellington.
Frigging Wellesley.
You know, and it wasn't. It was our Davy Baird. So she goes to Britain's...
We have to tell we have
Scotland.
forgotten to tell the best story of the lot, which is when he's originally captured at Pollylore,
Yes.
the prisoners are led off shackled together. This is one of the details that gets back to Scotland, that they're led 2 by 2, the prisoners, into the prison at Srirangapatnam. And his mother's only comment when she hears that David Baird has been taken and put in prison says, "I pity the man who's shackled to Ur Davy."
Anyway, the widow goes to David Wilkie, the most prominent Scottish portrait painter of the mid-19th century, and says, I need you to paint this historical picture, just reminding everybody
With no
that it was
Arthur
David,
Wellesley anywhere at all.
not in sight. And so there's David Baird discovering the body, standing over the grill of the jail in which he had been incarcerated before, just to kind of set the record straight. I want to say a word about this work, because we missed this one out. So this is Robert Carporter. This, again, is a print, what you're looking at. It's an enormous print. It's in 3 parts. The original painting, which doesn't survive any longer, the painting on which that print was based, was 120 feet long. I mean, and it was proportionately high. It was 12 feet high, I think, and 120 feet long. You're not going to get that in through the doors of the Royal Academy. It wasn't exhibited there. What he did is he hired the Lyceum Theatre in London, and he painted it in 6 weeks, and he exhibited it on a curved support. So the idea was, and he charged £1 to get in. So remember, the public would pay their £1, they'd go in, and they would be immersed in the storming of Srirangapatna. So the sheer opportunism and theatre of this as a work of art, I'm hoping to convey by this description what's going on here. This is not high art. Indeed, there were artists in London at the time. Henry Fuseli was a tremendous neoclassical snob, said it's not a work of art at all. It's got no literary content. I mean, poor old Henry Fuseli was trying to set up a thing called the Shakespeare Gallery, the purpose of which you can guess from its name. And so he just thought this was just incredibly vulgar. But it helped Robert Carporter greatly that Lord Harris, who was, along with Baird, the major figure, general commanding the forces, got back to London, saw the exhibition and said, "Yep, it was just like that. That's exactly how it happened." So he's got kind of corroboration from the horse's mouth. So the original painting of Carporter hoped to sell it to the company, who said, "No thanks, not really interested in this. Enormous work of art, don't know where to put it." And it was subsequently destroyed in a fire. But it exists in the printed version. And the interesting thing about the printed version is that there are copies of it in India. So it had some circulation here.
But the famous one at Srirangapatnam was actually only given by the Duke of Wellington in the 60s.
Oh,
The Duke of Wellington gives those hickeys. And what's the house called? Stratford Sigh.
Oh, yeah.
They're there till 1965 or something. And then they're given in Indira Gandhi periods, maybe even later, 1970.
Right.
And they only go to Srirangapatnam at that point.
But these are obviously meant really for a British audience. But I've spent too many years of my life working in the archives of palace museums. I find it in places like Jaipur and Udaipur, and you have to ask, what's it doing there? What was the reception of this image in an Indian princely court? I presume of, again, a slightly later period, anyway, we put it on display to ask what's its reception here now. So that's another different related question. I think we should open this to comment and question from you. Does anyone want to contribute?
Hello.
Do you want to just sort of say who you are and shout out?
My name is Rajendra.
General, old friends.
So, when we're talking about perception and how people figured in the British imagination at the time, it appears to be a lot more nuanced for an event which was so pivotal and dramatic. Where does this nuance come from? Because I read the exchange that you had with IE a couple of days in which you said, we generally tend to deify historic personalities or those make absolute villains out of them. There's no middle ground for us. Is in case of Tipu and his equation, why was it so? Was there an interpretation? Why was it so nuanced, if I forget?
I think there was admiration, wasn't there?
Oh, yes. But the question is disinterring it. So when you ask where does the nuance come from, I mean, for us, as it were, it comes from reading the works of serious scholars who've disinterred other source material, including, so much of what's written about Tipu is written entirely from using the English language material. That's obviously not all there is. And so the lead essay in this catalogue is written by Professor Janaki Nair, who dedicated her entire career to writing on the history of Karnataka. And one of the things she says is that a lot of the information that has been brought out by scholars, both Indian and indeed foreign scholars, in subsequent times, doesn't get into the public domain. It's not welcomed in the public domain precisely because it introduces nuance that people can't deal with.
I think Tipu was unquestionably the British opponent who got most airplay in Britain. Not the Marathas, not Rani Jhansi, not any of the others. Tipu is the one who is a popular name in Britain, and both demonized and admired at the same time. But it's interesting because it's a moving situation here. When I first came here, the sword of Tipu Sultan was on the telly, and he was a hero. And that move from hero to demon has been part of the rise of the Hindutva movement, the reassessment of Indian history, the lowering of the rank of the Mughals, and all that. And that's all something that's happened over the last 30 years. Tipu is a uniquely complicated character. And we haven't, in a sense, talked about Tipu as a good and bad man, but he is a complicated character. So if you actually go around Sri Rangapatnam today and go to all those lovely Hoysala temples and all those gorgeous, there's a huge number of very good big temples all around Mysore. And almost all of them have got what they call Padshah lingams. He's giving and so you can argue he's a very generous patron to the Hindus around him. But it's equally true that when he's at war and he's attacking Kerala or Coorg or any of the coastal Christian towns, he is vicious. And he forcibly converts, he murders, people are crushed under elephants, and all the horror stories, happen. There are very good accounts, and he does it to the British too. He's two very different people. On one hand, he's got a dream book where he's talking to Hindu gods and clearly believes that the gods, at some level, believes that the gods are there, or whether they're he talks to statues in ruined temples in his dreams. He has Hindu Brahmins in the court who cast auguries, and he never goes into battle. His troops go into sacred rivers and bathe before battle. He gives money to the Sringeri temple, which is destroyed by Pindari Maratha troops. But when he's at war, he's vicious. And this is one of the things that, in a sense, is not just a moral flaw, it's a political flaw, because his father says, you've got to fight with alliances. Hyder Ali was very good at keeping a united front. And Tipu doesn't do that. He pisses off the Marathas, he breaks the alliances, and he ends up fighting and dying alone. No one comes to his help, not Hyderabad, not. And there's one point when Nana Fadnavis, the Maratha leader, forges a very successful triple alliance against the company. And you have Tipu, Hyderabad, and all the different Maratha states, all united against the company. And if that had held, the company would never have won. But Hastings manages to break it by luring first of all Scindia, one of the Maratha leaders, away. And the Scindias are always up for changing sides, given an opportunity. And once it's broken, it doesn't come back together.
So the crucial thing is how you read the ambivalence. You take something, if you take the British perspective forward, as it were, a few decades, I refer in the catalogue to what was a very successful novel by Philip Meadows Taylor, who was also the author of, even more famously, of Confessions of a Thug. I don't know if you know that novel, because he worked with Sleeman. And so his novel Confessions of a Thug is based supposedly on...
Married into the Palmer family. When Meadows Taylor. And was a new James Kirkpatrick.
Worked for the Nizam, yeah. But so he writes a book called Tipu Sultan, A Story of the Mysore War, which is indeed villainizes Tipu. And yes, he acknowledges the existence of Brahmins at his court, but that is always told in a way that makes it look suspect. I mean, for example, it's narrated how Tipu allegedly tells the Brahmins to sacrifice British soldiers to Kali on the night before the siege. That doesn't look like patronage of a Hindu temple. But it's perfectly clear, again, from the historical sources, that he was the major patron of major... there are 4 very important temples that fell within his state, and he took on board, as it were, the traditional duties of a king to be the patron of those temples, irrespective of his private religious belief. And that sort of approach is actually very well drawn out. There's another modern scholar, apart from Janaki, who's written about this, an American scholar called Caleb Simmons, who's written a book called Devotional Sovereignty, which is about the way in which religion plays into kingship in South India in the 18th century. But he's talking both about the Wadiyas and about Tipu, and showing a continuity of practice between them. Sorry,
you mentioned how the tradition of British history painting originates from the portrayal of classical themes.
Yeah.
And I was wondering the degree to which British artists who have never been to India, are they perhaps drawing on archetypes that come from classical history, Alexander against the Persians, or I'm looking at this painting here of Tipu Sultan, surrounded by his sobbing women thing, which seems kind of reminiscent of Sardan of Hades, the effeminate Syrian who becomes the hero of Byron's play. Is that a kind of a part of the context?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, obviously, there's a level here of visual ignorance of India, as there would have been of the realities of the classical world. When
Benjamin West does his picture of the giving of the Diwani, and it's put up in the Royal Academy, one of the critics says that the dome looks far more like something like our noble St. Paul's than anything you'd find in India.
But that apart. So obviously because they are of the date they are. You have to understand that although the company's been around for 200 years, images of India have not. And it's not until you have images by Thomas and William Daniel, by William Hodges, that show buildings and landscape and some of the portraits start coming back that you have. And the clothes in Mather Brown's depiction of the boys leading the Zanana, I mean, quite apart from the absurdity of the women coming out of the Zananas to say goodbye under the gaze of the Mahouts, their clothes are entire fantasy. But what I think you're seeing, since you pointed to that one, is indeed there is a sense in which
it's total fancy dress over here.
Yeah, the immediate source for that is Gavin Hamilton's Andromache Bewailing the Death of Hector. But what Gavin Hamilton knew no more about the Trojan War than Singleton knew about the Mysore War. But what Hamilton did is he said, well, if I want to make it look classical, I'll use a composition that looks classical. So this is a very geeky art historical point, which will take me 30 more seconds to make. What would you look at? You'd look at, for example, a relief carving on a Roman sarcophagus, where everything happens across the plane. And then you look at that composition, that's exactly what's going on. There's no great depth. And it's because it's meant to look like, what Hamilton was trying to do was to make it look like something that you could see on a sarcophagus or indeed on a vase. And that's exactly that composition. And so again, there's an ambiguity in the picture because I think any visually literate British Briton in the audience, seeing that when it was painted, would see the connection with Gavin Hamilton and would say, well, he's classicizing it. He's making us think of Tipu like Hector, which actually means that he's imbuing him with some dignity, except that he's dead, as is Hector. Hector is very, very dead. You can't be deader than Hector.
But also the Trojans are the Eastern power.
Yeah.
The Greeks are the Western.
Yeah. But it's the notion, of the deadness, the emphasis of that is very palpable. At the same time, as saying, well, let's give him some dignity.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Kind of draws on what you said and then what was discussed right now. And I'm looking at it from the point of view of Tipu Sultan was sent across the ocean and processed as an image. And then what we are studying about him today is a lot from that image. It's drawn from what we've received again. So is there a sort of promotion of a kind of cultural mindset while looking at him that we still have?
But what's interesting is the parallel. What the company fears about Tipu is that he's a successful military force, a modernizing technocrat who uses the company's own army against the company. What Wellesley presents is this furious fanatic who is and it's more or less what Bush does to Saddam. And Saddam in exactly the same way, in order to soften up everybody for war, he's turned from this actually, horrible dictator, but a secular horrible dictator, into an Al-Qaeda figure, which he never was. He tortured Islamists, but Bush and that whole propaganda campaign that goes out on Saddam turns him into this bearded Islamic sort of Taliban figure, which he wasn't. So it's exactly the same tactics, 200 years apart.
But do you feel it worked? Did Tipu in fact change?
I think both propaganda campaigns were successful in that both figures are demonized.
Okay, so you mean that's whether it affected Tipu?
Tipu,
Saddam changed.
No. I think it's just perceptions. There's a propaganda campaign that before you go to war with someone, you demonize them.
Right.
And there's also something to do with kinship, I'm sure, because you wouldn't be that harsh to your own people as you would be to the people that you're intending to invade. So I'm sure that there's a nugget of truth to start with, and then it gets amplified.
And one of the people who works with Wellesley is William Kilpatrick, who then gets into Tipu's library and does a very selective series of translations to present Tipu in the years subsequently, in a sense, justified all this. And Kirkpatrick's selections from the papers of Tipu Sultan is the book that Mills and various other people use throughout the 19th century. And Tipu is turned into the fanatic.
But can I just return to your underlying question? Because I think we perhaps might have missed the core of it. And it's about what DAG is doing. We've brought this picture to India, and it's an antiquity. It's 200 years old, so it's now a registered antiquity. It's not leaving India ever again by law. It can't, right? Once we bought it and brought it here, it's here. So, as an art historian, my interest is trying to explain to you how the work was generated, what it meant to the audience, or to the artists and to the audience that produced it. But that is a quite separate question of what it might mean to you. So I haven't brought it here, we haven't brought it here to say, okay, this is the received, entrenched, unchanging view of Tipu. I'm just saying, well, here is an artifact that came out of a campaign, an ideology that's 200 years old. You make of it what you want. You interpret it for modern India.
And I must say the conversation you had was really enlightening around
Thank
all
you.
of this.
Thank you.
Has there been any sort of comparison between the British accounts of Tipu and the more local Tipu's palace records? Like, are they different?
Well, certainly, yes. You need to look at the work of scholarly historians to
But very little of Tipu's archives survive. Some of the library survives, and it's now in the British Library.
His whole library was transported. And the dream book that Willie referred to, where he recorded, it was written by him, he recorded his own dreams as revelations, that's in the British Library.
And there's all sorts of other things. You have a nice picture in here of the Nimatnama, which is a gorgeous manuscript made in Mandu of Sultan Girthudin's favourite samosas, his favourite scents, and various erotic potions that he recommends as sort of
the
Viagra.
early Sultanate text, but it belonged to Tipu Sultan. That's why we have it.
But a lot of the daftar, the office of Tipu, his records moved to Hyderabad and then are subsequently destroyed. So very little of his court records, I think I might be saying, survive today.
Yeah.
What's happening in Seringapatam today?
Amazing ruins, well worth in one winter day, starting early and circling around the walls. It's a astonishingly beautiful site. It's an island. It was already a fortress before Tipu, and it was already a temple island before it was a fortress. And so it has many layers, as everywhere here, of history. But its most magnificent surviving stuff are the French walls. A very nice mosque that you can still see the two minarets up there, and the Gopuram, and this very nice Nayaka era temple.
But to get a sense of what's there, do visit this room here, which has views by two artists who were in India, Robert Hyde Colebrook, who was a surveyor, and James Hunter, who was an artillery man, who both were on the spot and did landscapes of the...
A lot of Srirangapatnam is destroyed in 1799. There's terrible looting.
Anyway, I'm getting signals that we should wrap up. Thank you very much indeed.
This guy had one quick last question.
Yeah. You mentioned Tipu Sultan was in British, in Britain he has a reputation of the other leaders of his time. He is perhaps the most known.
Yes.
Is that just his reputation as a war leader, or do you think there's a reason to believe that he probably represented something, perhaps like a proto-nation state, something like the Emperor?
I think he's particularly remembered as a war leader. And the fact that he defeated the Brits. And then the Brits got to get their own back. That was
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Giles. Thank you, William.